whoever takes the leadership of LDP, I think it's very important for both Korea and Japan have a more flexible and open-minded approach to increase our dialogue, not only in the diplomatic issue, but also economic ties and then public exchange. So I think there's a lot of room to improve the situation now.
Hello and welcome to The Point. I'm your host, Lee Hee-yeon. The election that will decide Japan's next leader is approaching as Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga announced that he will not seek a new term as leader of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. Before getting to the point, here's a clip that will bring you closer to the topic we will be discussing today. Let's have a look. Now, Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga said he will not run in the ruling Liberal Democratic Party's leadership election.
自民党総裁選挙には出馬をしない、こうしたことを申し上げました。
Suga will leave office when his current term as Prime Minister expires on September 30th. His resignation was triggered by plummeting approval ratings and his weakening presence within the ruling party. The Japanese media has slammed Suga for his poor handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Prime Minister Suga's plan to resign is projected to add more obstacles for South Korea and Japan in advancing their relationship moving forward. All attention is now gathered on who will be the next Prime Minister of Japan. Taro Kono is among the politicians who are emerging as strong candidates to replace Suga. Who will fill the shoes of Prime Minister Suga, who will be stepping down just a year after taking office? In the studio with us today are Professor Song Se-ryun from Kyunghee University.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And Professor Choi Ji-yoon, who is from Seoul National University's Graduate School of International Studies.
Thank you for having me.
Professors, it's great to have you both on the program. Later on the program, we will connect live with Ms. Yukiko Toyota, who is a deputy editor at the Kyodo News Agency in Japan. Ms. Toyota, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Professor Song, let's begin our discussion with you. As you know, on the 29th of September, the Liberal Democratic Party will hold its leadership election. Now, how is this connected to who will become the next Prime Minister of Japan?
Well, Japan has a parliamentary system, and the ruling party's party leader becomes the Prime Minister. So the selection of the LDP party, assuming that LDP will continue to be the ruling party, becoming the party leadership, the selection process in 29th is de facto election of the next Prime Minister. So in that sense, there is very important. LDP had an outright majority so far in both chambers. Maybe they'll suffer some losses because of their low ratings, but because they have the coalition government at this point taken together, probably I think it's a safe bet that they'll continue to be a ruling party.
I see. Well, then, Mr. Chair, in this case, Prime Minister Suga has announced that he will not run for the leadership of the LDP. He said that he wants to focus on the COVID-19 pandemic and handling the situation in Japan, which is worsening. How much has the pandemic itself influenced the outcome of whether he will seek re-election or not?
Well, in my view, there are several factors that may influence him to make such a decision. First, as you mentioned, that his public approval rating were particularly low, as he could not really effectively deal with the pandemic outbreak. But at the same time, he pressed ahead with holding the Olympic Games in the middle of the pandemic. Although a majority of Japanese citizens wanted them to be cancelled or to be postponed. Second, Suga's party lost a majority in local election in Tokyo last July and also lost mayor election in Yokohama in August. And those results were seen as key indicators of the voters' attitude. And last, and probably the most important, is that Suga probably have lost his support from his party. So several LDP members raised their concerns that they could lose or they could suffer from major losses in the upcoming general election, which is planned this fall. And they actually wanted to choose a new MP to help the party to win the election. So in that sense, it's probably Suga's resignation looks like voluntary one, but he probably did not have other alternatives.
Right. Well, Professor Song, to follow up on that point then, obviously Prime Minister Suga probably had a blueprint for maintaining leadership, holding a successful Olympics, of course, then maybe having a general election, a snap election, so that he, without a vote, that he can then maintain his leadership within the party and then also become Prime Minister, sustain his prime ministership. So in this case, how did his plans go sideways because of the situation that has been developing?
Well, you can blame the coronavirus. I think that the Olympic was, as you mentioned, it had a scenario which was pretty well written until the time when Prime Minister Abe appeared in public announcing the holding of the Olympic. Probably that scenario and the subsequent influence on the economy and the morale, probably it would have been a very good script. But coronavirus kind of ruined it all. It was postponed. And I think at some point it became a pretty big gamble. Having a successful Olympics has many different aspects of it, but one of them is how to handle the coronavirus during and after the Olympics and the economics of it. And both counts, I think the public's expectation and also the view of it has soured significantly. I think Professor Che has mentioned that the general public in Japan wanted that Olympic to be postponed or canceled. I think some said 80% of them had that view. So in that sense, it was a gamble. At the end, did they overturn it? Did they make it better? Well, it seemed that the coronavirus has worsened and the economic outlook is not that good. So in that sense, that big gamble has not paid off.
Right. Well, Ms. Toyoda, how is the Japanese public reacting to the news that Suga will not run in the LDP leadership election?
Yeah, actually, it was a big surprise. On the previous day of his announcement, he has just mentioned he would seek re-election as a party leader of the governing party, which is LDP, to the senior party members. So it seemed to be a sudden change of mind, but there is no other choice for the Suga but to stepping aside this time, because as is mentioned in your program, his supporting rate is kept on dropping to the very dangerous zone, which is below 30%. At the recent polls, and the younger generation, the LDP, was the concern that the LDP would lose the election with the deeply unpopular leaders. So with the coming election imminent, I think LDP desperately needs who can win the election. So by then, Suga found out he had lost support of not only the younger generation of the LDP and the faction leaders of the LDP.
I see. Well, a survey conducted by Kyodo News showed that Taro Kono and Shigeru Ishiba are the frontrunners in what seems to be a four-way race. What are the qualities that make these two stand out from the other candidates?
The party leader selection set for the board in September 29th, and the process seems to be relatively open now. But as you mentioned, according to the public poll, the Ishiba and Kono seem to be frontrunners. And Taro Kono is very popular among young voters because of his very active presence of the social media with 2 million followers. But at the same time, the senior party members are a little bit wary about him because of his liberal standings, such as opposing to the nuclear power plants in the past. And maybe Kono's outspokenness could be a matter problem for the party leaders. And on the other hand, Ishiba, number 2 guy in the public polls with a supporting rate, is popular among the grassroots members. he has competed against Suga's predecessor, Shinzo Abe, in 2012. But some of the news outlets already reported Ishiba might not run for the race this time. And instead, he will support Kono because he's not sure of winning this time. So if the Kono secure the backing of the Ishiba, maybe I think the Kono will take the very obvious lead.
Right. Well, some Japan watchers anticipate that the internal division between the LDP party's sub-factions will not be strongly reflected in the upcoming election. Instead, they believe that the outcome will track public opinion. Do you agree with this observation?
I think, yes, I agree. I think, in the past, fractions has been provided the resources to the party members for the election, and the post after the election has been so influential. And the party faction leaders has been influential as well, and has a sway over the business and bureaucracies. But it's been changing. And the younger generation who have not experienced the difficult election under the leadership of Shinzo Abe since 2012 put more importance in the public opinion rather than the faction leaders' intention. For example, the biggest faction is the Hosoda faction in the LDP. Hosoda faction has not reached consensus about whom to support in the leader selection this time. Shinzo Abe is the most influential person in Hosoda faction, but he is poised to support Sanae Takeichi, who is a female contender who is very conservative, but she is not a member of the faction. And the rest of the member of the Hosoda faction has a different opinion. And the other thing is, I think maybe the generation change. The average age of the LDP is 59, and half of the member is below 60 years old. And 1/5 of the member of the LDP doesn't belong to a faction at all. So the LDP party itself is to be younger, and I think the gravity of the faction leader is changing. 23-term LDP lawmakers have a gathering, and they draw up the recommendation about how to proceed party selection. So they said, LDP should wipe out all the image that every decision made behind the doors and swayed by the faction leaders.
Right. Well, this will be the first general election in 45 years following the expiration of the full 4-year term for House of Representative members. Now, as Japan awaits for a new prime minister amid the pandemic and the economic fallout triggered by the Olympics, what kind of leadership does the Japanese public expect to see from Suga's successor?
Yes, public has been so frustrated with handling of the Suga about the pandemic, and also a lack of accountability that day, especially when Suga forced Tokyo Olympics amid the surge of the new infections, and also people are really tired with the continued restrictions of the economy. So people need a leader who have the adaptability to the changing situation and who is ready to break all the rules and also get things done type of the leader. And the people need a leader who maybe leads the nation out of the stagnation, which is posed by pandemic and by its own customs. But despite so much dissatisfaction and disillusionment with the government and politics itself, it's really tough, for the people to unseat the LDP at the coming election because the opposition party is so weak still, and there's no viable alternative to the LDP now. So yes, people need a change. Yes, people want to take a fresh start, but these changes maybe will be made within the framework of the waned status quo, I guess.
Right. Well, Ms. Toyoda, that's all the time we have. We appreciate your time and analysis on this issue.
Thank you very much.
Well, Professor Choi, we heard, of course, the situation in Japan is tumultuous because of Suga's resignation, but some are observing, of course, how this will impact South Korea-Japan relations, and many observe that it's unlikely to improve during the time of President Moon Jae-in's presidency, the time that he has left in office. What are your observations on that?
Well, many people said similar things when the President Moon decided not to visit Japan during the Tokyo Olympic over the summer. And actually, even if Japan have a new prime minister, it is unlikely Japan will make a significant movement in Korea-Japan relations until the upcoming presidential election here in Korea, which will be planned in next March. So, in my view, the role of the next administration of Korea is particularly important to increase or enhance Korea-Japan relations. And they need to, whoever takes the power, the administration need to come up with a specific plans to improve such relations. And I heard several candidates, several presidential candidates mentioned their plans to meet Japan. And also, they have a will to improve the relations. So I'm hopeful for the next administration.
Right. Well, speaking then of going forward then, even though South Korean candidates now are talking about engaging Japan, if Taro Kono becomes the next Prime Minister of Japan, it is seen to be a very difficult then to maybe improve Japan-Korea relations. As you know, he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs under the Abe administration when the wartime forced labor cases came out here in Korea, and he took a very hardline stance.
Right. His image in Korean, the public's mind is not that good at this point. But we have to look at it comparatively. Compared to other candidates, probably he's not as right-wing as other candidates and maybe moderate. And those people who know him say that his moderate stance stands out in that poll. His father, Yohei Kono, was very friendly to Korea. So initially, we had a good inklings about him. But under very right-wing policies of Abe, he was just following the party line at this point. I think that if it becomes the prime minister, not only does it indicate the generational change, I think if he's left alone to formulate his own policies, diplomatic policies with Korea, a lot of people expect or have hopes that he will be a less right-wing stance and also very commonsensical. So I don't know who is speaking, looking at the right ball at this point, but I think that his prime ministership, if that happens, will signal a lot of changes.
I see. Well, then speaking of someone who may take a more, let's say, dovish stance on South Korea-Japan relations, Shigeru Ishiba is also seen as a potential candidate for the premiership. And so, can we expect, if he becomes prime minister, will there be a change in the relationship between South Korea and Japan? And how do you think the Japanese public view him as a potential candidate?
Well, I think Ishiba is considered to be more open-minded in terms of the Korea-Japan relations. I heard several times that he mentioned that Japan should be more flexible on the issues related to Korean historical issue with Korea. And also, he emphasized that Japan needs to strengthen its security ties with Korea. So I think he's definitely more favorable in terms of increasing or enhancing the Korea-Japan relations. However, to be elected to be a prime minister in Japan, the candidate needs a very strong support among the LDP parliamentarians. And given that he's from a minority political group, his chance to be elected as a prime minister might not be high. And I was also told that he might be not even run the election. He might withdraw his plan to run.
Right, and of course, Ms. Toyoda mentioned that fact as well. Well, also, Ms. Toyoda mentioned that Shinzo Abe was supporting a very conservative nationalist female politician who has his backing, apparently. And so, with respect to then her presence as a contender for the job, how will this affect the election?
It's puzzling at this point because she didn't have the public persona that are high on people's mind. Some people thought that the Shinzo Abe is pushing for her candidacy is a ploy to divide the votes between Ishiba Shigeru and other members. But at this point, if the Ishiba does not run, probably the purpose is gone. I think that the Shinzo Abe's preference of her is pretty obvious because of the kind of synchronization of between two ideological planes and the policies. So that would be something that Shinzo Abe wants to bring about. But at this point, because of the low ratings overall in the LDP, whether the strong factional politics will trump over what people want, that's something that we would like to go on. But the alternative is not that bad for Shinzo Abe, because if he doesn't go with the female politicians, the other one, the Aso faction and the Abe faction is pushing for a very conservative candidate at this point. So that probably is a very safe choice for Shinzo Abe as well.
Right. Well, Mr. Chair, given the dynamics then within the LDP, there are a lot of people who view that this political transition will really not improve South Korea-Japan relations moving forward. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yes, as Professor Song mentioned, the LDP is most likely to be the next ruling party. So the change in the political power, meaning the change of the leader of LDP, but the government will not change, and also the ruling party will not change. So in that sense, the leadership, like making the change within the leadership in LDP, is very important to improve the relations between Korea and Japan. And many people mentioned that Japan, the society of Japan, becoming more conservative. But I disagree with that, because I see that there's a Hallyu boom. Like many Japanese citizens enjoy Korean culture and food. So I think the public opinion of Japan is not necessarily against Korea. And I think there's a room to enhance the dialogue and cooperation. But the bigger problem is that the LDP is becoming more conservative. So like making the LDP leadership to be more favorable to Korea, or be making them more open-minded and making them to have a more dialogue with Korea is crucial to improve the relations. Right.
Well, Professor Song, Prime Minister Suga's decision to step down now has, of course, I think, pushed the general election into November. Mm-hmm. And this, of course, has changed the political landscape in Japan. So what do you think will be, so what are your projections then with respect to this landscape in the next coming months?
Well, the change I see is that normally the lower house has a 4-year term, but it has been disbanded before the term is over. But this time it will be a little bit different. But as you said, it will be postponed because of the schedules that the LDP has. They have to pick the new prime minister, they have election in 29th, and then that has to be confirmed by the emperor next month. So that kind of schedule pushes back the election for the lower house probably maybe to November. But that does not mean that it is a boon for either the opposition party or other factions. I think that the schedule in Japan, even if it is delayed, would be as expected as those candidates represent at this point. I think that going back to the key issue is whether there would be a generational change in Japanese politics if Mr. Koro becomes the prime minister. I think that implication to Korean politics is significant, but at this point there are a lot of question marks whether he will follow the policies under Abe or, as other people expect, whether he will revert back to his father's line and also more of a reform-minded line.
Right. Professor Chae, your thoughts on the potential change in the landscape in Japan?
Yeah, well, first of all, in terms of the schedule, I agree with the Professor Song that the schedule is most likely to postpone to end of November, which is close to the term ends of the House of, which is close to the House of Representative term ends, which is November 28th. So, but after that, whoever takes the leadership of LDP, I think it's very important for both Korea and Japan have a more flexible and open-minded approach to increase our dialogue, not only in the diplomatic issue, but also economic ties and then public exchange. So I think there's a lot of room to improve the situation now.
Right. Well, professors, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you both for coming in and sharing your knowledge and insights with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.